Hi, everyone. It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. And I am so excited to welcome today's guest back again. I think this is our third, Nancy. But we always say we got to get it done in time for tax time. And this year we're finally doing it. So today we're going to be talking about reclaiming your financial power, especially during the divorce process and doing things properly. But before you even introduce yourself again, Nancy, one of the questions that I wanted to start with, because we get this all the time, is for our couples who start to divorce during the process, they're like, should I file joint during a divorce or not? Can you just briefly talk about the pros and cons, and then we'll have you introduce yourself?
Sure. And for starters, you're definitely not required to file jointly. So I think there can be a misconception out there that if you're married, you have to file jointly. Sometimes a judge might even encourage the two parties to file jointly, but really the choice is yours, and there are benefits and drawbacks to each option. So, for example, filing jointly with your spouse allows you to get a larger tax deduction for that filing status. And there are some credits that you might be eligible for, and you would only get if you file jointly, not if you file separately. But the drawback, and I think it can be a big one, especially if you're going through a divorce, if it's a contentious situation, is that if there is a balance due on the tax return, or if the tax return later gets audited by the IRS and there's a balance due, the IRS can hold either party responsible. So they can hold either spouse responsible, even if one spouse was a stay-at-home spouse and the other spouse wasn't. If they're filing a joint return, you're basically agreeing, I'm agreeing to be held responsible for any debt that could result from the return. So it could happen in situations where there's a balance on the return, but I think what's worse is when the return gets filed and maybe your spouse misreports some things, leaves some income off, and later the IRS catches on and audits the return and makes adjustments. And then there's a balance due resulting from that. So you weren't expecting that to happen, but now you're on the hook for it. So I think there's definitely some risk to filing jointly, especially when you're going through a divorce. But like I said, filing separately, you may not qualify for all of the credits that you would normally qualify for, especially if you have children. So if you were all living in the same household, but decide to file separately, most likely you would miss out on things like the earnings tax credit if you're a low income working individual. So it's just something to weigh, I think, when you're going through the process, to think about what might make more sense for your individual situation.
Yeah, thank you. As you're talking about, you might be on the hook, and if the person's misreporting, I think in our community this happens all the time. And I know in my own divorce, my lawyer said just file separately, because you want to start detaching,
Right,
disentangling, I should say.
right.
So Nancy, can you now officially introduce yourself again for
Yeah,
those who
sure.
don't already know you from the past?
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm Nancy Rossner. I'm an attorney, and I'm also the executive director of the Community Tax Law Project. And we are a nonprofit organization in Richmond, Virginia, covering the state of Virginia, providing free, direct legal services to low-income individuals that have issues with either the IRS or the Virginia Department of Taxation. But what's cool is we're part of a national program. So there are clinics like ours throughout the United States that provide the same services that we do, serving the same community that we do. The focus on, vulnerable populations, including survivors of domestic violence.
Yeah, and we are so grateful to have met you a few years ago, because we send people to your tax clinics all the time, and they can't believe that people like you and your organizations exist.
Yeah, I
So,
think people don't realize we exist until they really need us. And then they're like, oh, I'm so glad that this exists. Because it's not really something you think about until I think you have an issue. And it's such a specialized area of law. I think there are some things you can navigate on your own, but if you're able to have a tax professional helping you, I think it just increases the chances of a better outcome.
yeah, I mean, anything we can find that can calm people down, because they're already dealing with so many other things. So
Right.
this is wonderful. So speaking of abusive relationships, what are some common ways that people abuse taxes during divorce that you see?
So I think one of the main ones is if there's children involved, and in thinking about custody and who might have the right to claim the children, or trying to negotiate that right to claim the children, or claim the child that you share. Um, so I think it's, obviously that's a difficult road to navigate on its own, but depending on what you decide, there could also be tax implications. And I think it's common now in divorces to assign, who might have the right to claim a particular child in even years or odd years. So it's important to remember, if you're making that agreement, that is a contract. And if you decide to stray from that, and claim what you want to claim when you file the return, you're essentially breaking that contract, and you could be civilly liable for that if your spouse was to sue you in court. Um, and, the IRS is not required to follow what those agreements say because it's a state court versus federal government agency, but they can use what was agreed to in state court um, to sort of influence, I guess, how the IRS would look at a particular situation. So if there is an agreement to alternate claiming the child for tax years, the IRS would consider that and weigh that in favor of, whose turn it was that year. And let's say both parents try to claim the same child, they might look to that agreement to determine, okay, there was a decision ahead of time that this person is the right person to claim the child. And that could influence the IRS's decision. But there is one thing to remember, and I think sometimes this gets lost because, family law attorneys know a great deal but may not sort of know sort of those little ins and outs when it comes to tax law. So things like the earned income tax credit, which can be a really big refundable credit, meaning it's putting money back into your pocket when you have children and you're low income and you're working. That credit follows the child. So that is not one that you can give away to the other parent. So even if in your divorce decree you're agreeing to have one parent claim the child that year, they're able to claim them as a dependent and claim them for the child tax credit, which is also a beneficial credit that can put money back into your pocket. But it's who the child's with the majority of the year that gets to claim the earned income tax credit. And that one can be thousands of dollars just depending on how old your child is, what your income is for that year, because it is geared towards low income individuals. So at a certain point, that credit does sort of max out. So that's something I would want survivors to remember going through the process of a divorce. I do think that negotiating those items can be a bargaining chip. And I've heard of that, being used sometimes if you're trying to work something out and, you might be willing to say, okay, I'll let you claim the children in odd years and I'll claim them in even years, if that helps to get you where you need to go as far as negotiations go. But just sort of calling back to that discussion we had at the beginning here about married filing joint, again, I would be cautious about agreeing to file married filing joint, especially if you're feeling pressured to do so through the divorce proceeding, just because of the risks that we mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And although in a divorce decree, you can have one partner saying, I'm going to take full responsibility of the taxes, or I'm going to take 75% of the responsibility of our tax debt. The IRS does not have to follow that agreement. Again, it's a state decision in state court. It can influence how the IRS proceeds when both spouses owe. But it's not that the IRS is going to see that agreement and say, oh, okay, well, we're going to zero out the account, of the one spouse, and we're going to put it all on the account of the other spouse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there needs to be some sort of mechanism in there where if the spouse that's agreeing to pay the tax is not doing what they promised to do, that you have some sort of recourse. You have some sort of way of bringing that before the judge again, or making sure that they're paying what they're supposed to pay. Because we've definitely seen situations where one spouse agreed to take responsibility for the tax, but when it came down to it, they just didn't. And aside from trying to take them again to court, filing a civil suit, there may not be a whole lot that you can do before the IRS to try to say, okay, I'm not supposed to be responsible for this. We had an agreement. So I think if there is some way to build in some solution, if they don't pay what they're supposed to pay, it would be important to include that in any agreement that they would sign during the divorce proceedings.
Yeah, we always think about that as enforcement language that has deadlines and consequences, because without that, there's really not much you can do.
Yeah, 100%.
Because it's very hard to even find someone in contempt of an order if there's no clear language that says, well, when was it supposed to happen? Because the person say, oh, I'm still taking care of it, and years later.
Right. So maybe language saying establish an installment agreement by such and such date, start making payments by such and such date, like you said, enforcement language, deadlines, so that you can hold them accountable if they're not doing what they've agreed to do, through that process.
Yeah, I would change your word of if they don't, but when they don't, because we know in our community how often this happens. So it's just, you just plan for what you're going to do when it happens.
Right.
It makes things easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned a couple other things about tax credits for kids. Is there anything else regarding children that people should know when they think about taxes, or even when they're thinking about putting together a parenting plan, like things that we might not have even thought? Like, I didn't think about the tax credit. I figured, my lawyer's going to handle that part. But other things regarding kids?
Yeah. So, when it comes down to it, a lot of the IRS tax credits involving children revolve around who had the child more during the year. So looking down to specific number of nights. So I think one thing that you can do is keep track of what nights you have, the child. Keep maybe just a separate calendar where you can just notate, whether you have the child or the children with you or you didn't, so that you can tally up at the end of the year to see, okay, how many nights were they with me? How many nights were they not with me? Because if they were with you more nights, over half the nights of the year, then probably you're going to be the one that's eligible to claim them unless you have an agreement otherwise. But like I said, the earned income tax credit always follows the child. So, regardless of who's claiming the child as a dependent or for the child tax credit, there's this separate credit that you might still be able to claim them for, even if the other parent's claiming them for those other two things. But it really comes down to, who is the child living with for the majority of the year, and being able to provide proof. So keeping those records, those what IRS would call contemporaneous records, meaning you're like writing it down as it's happening, that could be proof if it later gets called into question who the child was living with, more during the year. And then I think just other things, making sure that your information is on file with the school, with the doctor's office. You later have to get additional supporting records about, who the child was with and who their primary caregiver was. Because if the IRS questions your tax return and you're claiming the children, and I would say this happens most often when both parents try to claim the same child. So
I was just about to ask you that too.
Yeah. That's usually what sends up a red flag for the IRS, because the system isn't going to allow two separate returns to claim the same child for the same thing. So I know I talked about you could have one parent claiming them for as a dependent and for the child tax credit, but you could still have the other parent claiming them for their earned income tax credit. So when you have two returns claiming the same children for the same credits, claiming them as a dependent, red flag goes up at the IRS, and usually the IRS is questioning the second person to file. So I think additional advice in there would be try to file as early as you can in the filing season, as soon as you have the records that you need, you're writing on your W-2 or you're writing on your 1099. Because the longer you wait, I think the more risk there is that your spouse or ex-spouse will try to file and claim the kids. And the IRS system generally is not going to allow you to then file and claim the kids if you're trying to do it electronically. So it'll say, oh, error, someone already claimed them, or someone already claimed you, because we know that's an issue too, right? Is a spouse or ex-spouse filing a tax return and claiming you without your permission. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you would file by paper is one option. Now the IRS is also offering that if you have an IP PIN, an identity protection PIN number, that you can, the system, I guess, will allow you to file electronically, even if you're the second filer, if you have this IP PIN and you can enter it on the tax return. That's something you can apply for through the IRS website. There's also a form, I think it's the 15227. But basically, it's a PIN number that's unique to you, and the IRS will assign a new one to you every year, and it helps you safeguard your tax return, because then the IRS knows if they receive one without that IP PIN, that it may have been filed by someone who didn't have the authority to do it. So I think that's another thing that survivors can do, is applying for these IP PINs. And something came up really recently where, because I'm on different listservs, and there's one for VITA, which is a free income tax preparation resource. And they were talking about someone trying to retrieve their IP PIN, but they couldn't get access to their account. Don't let that be a barrier. There are ways to try to reestablish your identity, get access to your account. But I know that, there's so many barriers. I think especially for survivors, there's so many barriers, and we just have to think about ways to overcome that and not let that prevent you from what you're entitled to, from your, establishing your rights and, claiming what you're entitled to. So I think that's something, like low-income taxpayer clinics like mine can help with, because there are so many barriers, and it, sometimes it's hard to keep pushing through, right? So I think just knowing maybe what resources you have available to you and what your rights are can be so important, and maybe empower you to keep fighting.
Yeah, and I think that it's so important that you noted that, because one of our favorite quotes is from a friend of ours who's a bodyguard named Steve, and he said, an abuser's greatest tool is fear. And I think when you're with someone for a length of time, especially in an abusive relationship, they will tell you what your rights are, and you believe them when it's not true. And that's why it's so important to know that there's resources out there that you can actually find out what your rights are, rather than what somebody who has a vested interest in harming you is telling you your rights are.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you talked about the IP PIN and filing with paper, trying to file first. Is there any other things you can think of that we should definitely know to protect ourselves and safeguard our finances during tax season?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I hadn't mentioned yet was this concept of a superseding tax return. So if you have reason to believe that you were already claimed on a tax return, either as a spouse, usually as a spouse, or that they filed, I guess, a separate tax return for you, but without your permission. As long as you're filing your own return by the filing deadline of, April 15th, or with an extension, October 15th, even if the IRS is receiving multiple tax returns for you, the last one they receive by that April 15th deadline, they will consider the superseding return, meaning it supersedes all the other returns they receive. And that becomes your original return. So I'll give an example why this might be important. We had a client who filed a joint return with her estranged spouse. And in this situation, he had promised to share the refund with her, even though the kids were living with her. So she agrees to file jointly with him. He gets the refund, then says, you know what, I'm not sending you any money, or maybe sends her like a really minimal. And so then she's frustrated because she's thinking, well, this is, this is not what we agreed to. And although she had agreed to file a joint return with him, which makes that return legitimate, the outcome was not what they had agreed to. So because it was still prior to April 15th, she had a right to go in and file her own separate return, head of household with the kids, because the kids were living only with her. And that was considered the superseding return for her, meaning that.
So that was the one that was used.
Canceled out. Yep. Canceled out the joint return. She ends up getting her refund. He ends up owing that money back to the IRS because he got, then if he's not allowed to claim the kids, that's usually where a lot of that refund money comes.
Oh, how satisfying.
Yes. Yes. So I think that's a really good example of how the superseding return can come into play, because you can't say that first return was not valid because she had agreed to filing it with him. But, the outcome was not what they had agreed to. And she was still within her rights to go ahead and file her own separate return. And she went ahead and did that. It had a really good outcome for her.
Yeah, I love it because it's preventative. It was like something that was taken care of, that avoided court and more money wasted and arguments, just like, boop, I figured out how to take care of it myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. All right. So you mentioned, your tax clinics. Are there other tax resources for people to figure all this stuff out?
Yeah, so I wanted to mention, if you want to look at the list of other tax clinics like mine, again, we don't charge for our services because we receive federal funding, and some of the other clinics are associated with a law school or with a legal services organization. The list is in IRS publication 4134. So if you just Googled that, you would get the full list of all of the tax clinics that are currently open. And there's generally at least one in every state. So I think that's a really great resource. The IRS website itself has a lot of really great information. FAQs, I think, can be really helpful, especially when it comes to these questions of custody and claiming children on tax returns. So I think that can be a good resource if you, usually I actually don't use their search function on their website. I find it easier to use something like Google and type in IRS and then my question, and that might pop up things. But you can also use the search function on their website and try to find like FAQs about the different topics. And lastly, there's the taxpayer advocate service that can help in certain situations. They have limited case criteria in terms of like what they will take, and it's usually like hardship situations. They're actually a part of the IRS, but they're considered an independent part of the IRS. But sometimes if IRS just isn't following proper procedure and you can't resolve things in other ways, sometimes the taxpayer advocate service can step in and help out. So I would say that's another resource. And then lastly, we are during filing season right now. So there are a few different free options when it comes to filing your tax return. So the IRS has a list on their website of free file partners where they offer free filing, at least for the federal return. So what I found is it can be a little tricky because they'll advertise, your federal is free, but then your state might cost something. So I think it's good to do the quiz. There's a little quiz that the IRS has on their page when they're talking about this free software, where you can enter in the type of income you have and what you intend to claim on your return. And it'll tell you like the different options as far as the free software for you. So you don't end up, I think it's the worst when you put all the information in and then it wants to charge you and you're like, no, this was supposed to be free. So I think if you try to, do the quiz and research some of that ahead of time, that can be helpful. But I would say the biggest resource that we try to connect people with during filing season is the VITA program through the IRS. So it stands for Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. And it's a federally funded program where volunteers get certified to prepare tax returns for free, and they do it in person at different sites all over the U.S. Usually it's at like libraries, community buildings, things like that. But you can make an appointment, some allow walk-in hours, and bring your documents, and they will prepare your return. They will electronically file it for you. So it's, just as fast as if you went to a paper preparer. And I think it's a really great option because it always kills me when we have clients that come to us and, for one reason or another, we need to see a copy of their return. And when they're spending like hundreds of dollars to file a really basic return, I just hate that because I know that there are these other great resources out there. It's just a matter of knowing, what's available to you. So you can usually dial like your number for information in your state. They might have the resources there, but the IRS website also has a VITA site locator where you can type in your zip code and they'll tell you all of the tax prep sites in your area. United Way, if you go to their website, they also offer free income tax return preparation. And lastly, AARP also does free tax return preparation. And I don't think you need to be a member of AARP or even of a certain age. They just offer this as a service to the community. There is a limitation on income, and it's usually, I think, around $67,000 gross income for the year. You have to be around there or below that to be eligible. But I encourage everyone that's eligible to use that resource. And I know I've been droning on a little bit, but the last one I will mention, VITA also has an online option. So for someone who isn't able to go and visit the physical site, if you go to getyourrefund.org, you can have your tax return information sent over to the preparers electronically. You do have to prove that you are who you say you are. I think they require maybe like photos with you and your ID. But you'll send your information over and they'll do it all like over the internet, basically. So you might be emailing back and forth or texting back and forth. But I think it's a really great option for folks who are in rural areas or maybe can't leave the house or don't have transportation to still get their tax return done for free using this really great service.
Wow. I mean, this is just so fantastic because it makes it easier for people. It's free or really cheap. And there's other ways to do things that I think most people would never think. I certainly didn't know about any of this, except from talking to you.
Yeah.
But that is just wonderful. So again, can you remind people about Community Tax Law Project?
Yeah, sure.
How they can find it?
Yeah, so the Community Tax Law Project, we're a low-income taxpayer clinic located in Richmond, Virginia, serving the entire state of Virginia. You can check our website out at www.ctlp.org. You can contact us through our website if you have tax questions and you need some advice. We've had people reach out, people mentioning, watching your videos and reaching out with tax questions. So we're always happy to help and provide advice because we know this is it's a niche, unique area of law. And unless you need it, you're not necessarily thinking about it. And, I think it's really great to have these clinics, which are full of tax professionals, that this is what our focus is. This is what we do every day. We just focus on IRS issues and Virginia tax issues and representing our clients, and then also getting out there in the community and doing, educational presentations on what your rights are and what your responsibilities are when it comes to tax. So thank you so much for having me back. It's always
thank you. I'm like, this needs to be like our annual tradition.
Let's do it.
All right. Thank you so much, Nancy. It was great seeing you again.
You too. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay. Bye.